Hello and welcome back. In today's video, which will cover Ether chapters 6 and 7, we'll see the Jaredites reach the promised land. But also, one thing that you'll notice in the book of Ether is an unusual tendency for the kings to have children well into their old age, sometimes marrying a wife young enough to continue having kids. Why was this? And also, why did Ether consider this important enough to record? We'll address that in just a few minutes. But first we have today's trivia question, which is in a similar vein. In the Book of Mormon, which person is recorded as having the most children? In Ether chapter 6, we return to Jared and his brother as they prepare to cross the ocean. In chapter 3, we read of the Lord touching the 16 stones made by Jared, but if we read more closely, he may have done more than simply touch them with his finger, because in Ether chapter 3 verse 4, Jared's brother says, "Touch these stones, O Lord, with thy finger, and prepare them, that they may shine forth in darkness." Now in Ether chapter 6 verse 2, Moroni the narrator says that after the Lord had prepared the stones, the brother of Jared brought them down from the mountain and put one at each end of the 8 vessels. What the Lord might have done to prepare the stones, we can only guess. Verse 3, "And thus the Lord caused stones to shine in darkness, to give light unto men, women, and children, that they might not cross the great waters in darkness." But although there was light in the barges, it was a very rough trip. First, they had animals in their barges and enough food and presumably water to feed them all. Perhaps the hole in the top also allowed them to gather rainwater sometimes. Second, the barges were driven by a furious wind, which caused them to be tossed upon the waves of the sea before the wind. Mountain waves crashed down on them, completely submerging them, and the wind did never cease to blow towards the promised land while they were upon the waters. I still think, and this is just my opinion, that they probably kept the barges open most of the time, or as often as they could. It would have gotten hot inside with everything sealed up and the sun beaten down, and those miraculous glowing stones that gave them light. Did they have a way to turn them off at nighttime, or maybe a dimmer switch? The narrator tells us that for 344 days they traveled upon the water. Based on the rough directions given, they went north from Babylon and launched their barges from somewhere probably near the Black Sea or maybe the Mediterranean, but either way, depending on their route, they needed to travel roughly 7,000 miles to reach the Americas. And if you divide that distance up over 344 days, their average speed was a little less than 1 mile per hour. So they were just barely moving. But again, these were barges, not ships, so most of the time they probably just felt like they were there bobbing on the water, not even moving at all. And 11 months is a long time to sit there and bob on the water when you can't see land. So how do you fill all that time? Apparently there was a lot of singing. The brother of Jared sang, and it also says that they sang, but honestly, what else was there to do? Some people speculate that they made multiple stops as they traveled, which is a possibility, but you can't travel from the old world to the new world without crossing the actual ocean at some point. But eventually they made it. Verse 12, "And they did land upon the shore of the promised land, and when they had set their feet upon the shores of the promised land, they bowed themselves down upon the face of the land, and did humble themselves before the Lord, and did shed tears of joy before the Lord because of the multitude of his tender mercies over them. After landing, they went forth, tilled the land, and began to multiply." We don't know exactly how many people they started with, and we don't know how many were adults and how many were children. But if there were 8 barges, it's a safe bet that there were at least 2 to 4 adults per barge. And verse 16 tells us, "And the friends of Jared and his brother were in number about 22 souls. And they also begat sons and daughters before they came to the promised land." But that's all we have to work with. Eventually, Jared and his brother began to grow old. Jared's brother called the people together. He was their leader, and he wished to number them before he died, and know of them what they will desire of us before we go down to our graves. And what the people wanted was for Jared's brother to anoint his oldest son to be their king. To which he responded, "Surely this leadeth into captivity." Now, the type of government that the Jaredites seem to expect is called primogeniture, where the oldest son becomes the next ruler, similar to how if King Charles dies, Prince William is the heir to the throne. Thus, they expected the firstborn son of Jared's brother was older than Jared, to be the king. Here's verse 25. "And it came to pass that they chose even the firstborn of the brother of Jared, and his name was Pagag. And it came to pass that he refused, and would not be their king, and the people would that his father should constrain him. But his father would not. And he commanded them that they should constrain no man to be their king. So next they checked if any of his other sons wanted to be king. Jared's brother had 22 children, and we don't know how many sons, but none of them was willing to be king. With the brother of Jared's children all having turned down the crown, they next turned to the descendants of Jared, who was the younger brother. He had 4 sons and 8 daughters, and his sons' names were Jachem, Gilgah, Mahah, and Orihah. And this is what we talked about in the video about Ether 1 and 2. The record has a lot more detail about Jared's family than it does about the brother of Jared's family. We know Jared's name. We know that he had 4 sons. We know the names of all 4 sons. By contrast, although we know that Jared's brother had 22 children, we don't know how many of them were sons, nor do we know any of their names except for Pagag. In fact, we don't even know the name of the brother of Jared, who was the prophet and who led them to the promised land from Babylon. So if you want your name remembered, it's good to be part of the royal line. More than 1,000 years later, when Ether traced his parentage back in Ether chapter 1, he listed himself as being a descendant of Coriantor and then traced the Jaredite royal line from Coriantor back to Orihah and Jared at the very beginning. It's mathematically unavoidable that Ether was a descendant of Jared's brother too, and of every single other person who was on any of the 8 barges. That having your lineage recorded is a royal privilege. And I think I've beaten that point to death now. All of Jared's brother's sons declined to be king, and so did Jared's sons, all except for Orihah, the youngest. And despite apparently being the baby of the family, the youngest son of the youngest brother, Orihah was a good king who walked humbly before the Lord, it says. So instead of the oldest becoming king, the youngest son of the youngest son became the king. And it appears that this became the pattern. Going forward, the Jaredites didn't use a system of primogeniture, but appeared to have adopted what is called ultimogeniture as the pattern for transferring the crown. Ultimogeniture is the tradition of making the youngest son the heir to the family's property or the throne. Primogeniture is much more common, but ultimogeniture is not unknown. You typically find it among peasant families where the older children make their way out into the world and the youngest one is left taking care of the parents. But why did the Jaredites adopt that instead of just treating Orihah's coronation as a one-off? Why did it lead to a system of government where the youngest son becomes the next ruler? To answer that, imagine that King Orihah is growing old and it's time to pass the kingdom on to the next generation. And you're his royal advisor. And you think, in your heart of hearts, that primogeniture is a better system. How do you tell that to King Orihah, who was the youngest son of the youngest son? Do you tell him, hey, appointing the youngest son is kind of a stupid idea? You'd score a lot more points with Orihah, who was the youngest, by pointing out all the benefits, whatever they may be, of having the youngest son be the ruler. And so, in my opinion, that may explain how it became the system going forward. But was ultimogeniture really the Jaredite system or tradition? Was that really what happened, or am I just making up silly what-if scenarios? Well, let's have a look. In Ether chapter 7, 2 and 3, Orihah had 23 sons, and it came to pass that he begat Kib in his old age. And it came to pass that Kib ruled in his stead. Kib would be taken captive by his son Korihor, but, verse 7, in his old age, Kib begat Shul, who defeated Korihor and ultimately succeeded Kib on the throne. Then in verse 26, we find Shul begetting sons and daughters in his old age. Ether 9:14 tells of Omer begetting Emer in his old age and making him successor on the throne. In chapter 10, Shez did live to an exceedingly old age, and he begat Replakish, and he died, and Replakish reigned in his stead. There are more examples of this, but that should be enough to show that it's a pattern. This also might explain why, although the Jaredites lasted for roughly 1,500 years, when Ether gives the lineage in chapter 1, he only lists 29 generations. That's an average of about 50 years per generation. We usually think of a generation as 20 or 25 years because 20 or 25 years old is generally the age at which people have their first kid. But if a generation is measured by when you have your last child, generation can be a lot longer. There's another consequence of ultimogeniture that we see throughout Jaredite history. Picture how you would feel as the oldest son growing up royalty, but knowing that if your dad has another boy, you won't be the next king. It's just a matter of time before your kid brother rules over you. That baby in the cradle is your future ruler, unless mom has another one. So we see a lot of older Jaredite sons, knowing they would not inherit the throne, dethroning or attempting to dethrone their fathers. Here's Ether 7:4. And when Korihor was 32 years old, he rebelled against his father. Ether 7:15. And it came to pass that Noah rebelled against Shul, the king, who was his grandfather, and also his father Korihor. In Ether 8:2. And Jared rebelled against his father and came and dwelt in the land of Heth. Ether 9:26. And Heth began to embrace the secret plans of old to destroy his father. And it came to pass that he did dethrone his father, for he slew him with his own sword, and he did reign in his stead. Ether 10. And his eldest son, whose name was Shez, did rebel against him. Nevertheless, Shez was smitten by the hand of a robber because of his exceeding riches, which brought peace again unto his father. Later in Ether 10, we have a presumably older brother rebelling against his younger brother. And Morianton did live to an exceeding great age, and he then begat Kim. And Kim did reign in the stead of his father, and he did reign 8 years, and his father died. And it came to pass that Kim did not reign in righteousness, wherefore he was not favored of the Lord. And his brother did rise up in rebellion against him, by which he did bring him into captivity. And we see the pattern in Ether 11. And Hekam lived to a good old age and begat Shiblam. And Shiblam reigned in his stead, and the brother of Shiblam rebelled against him, and there began to be an exceedingly great war in all the land. So it appears that the system of ultimogeniture had the consequence of making a lot of older sons rebel, because that was their only way of retaining the throne. They knew that their younger brother was someday going to be their king. Now we move to Ether chapter 7. With Arihah as the king, the Jaredites multiplied and prospered. Arihah himself had 31 children, 23 of which were sons, and he continued fathering into his old age. Picture that. The youngest son will become the next king, and you're his 22nd son. You'd think that that would be good enough, but nope. Son number 23 is born and knocked you right off the pedestal, and you joined the ranks of your 21 older brothers who had also lost their standing as heir to the throne. Makes you wonder what the bullying would have been like. If the king was the baby of the family, he might not have had much patience for bullying, and I'm way off in the weeds now, and I need to get back on track. Whether having 23 sons was typical for everyone, we're not told, but such numbers are usually only possible through polygamy or remarriage, unless the word son simply means male descendant rather than actual son, as was the case in biblical Hebrew, but that's not the case here because it says that Arihah beget them. In any case, by verse 5, their numbers have grown sufficiently for Arihah's grandson Korihor to gather an army. And as we go through this, I'm not going to devote much time to Jaredite politics in general, unless there's a compelling reason to do so. Instead, I'm going to switch over and briefly talk about geography such as it is. In verse 6, Moroni very briefly described where the Jaredites were located in relation to where the Nephite nation was. Here's verse 6. Now the land of Moron, where the king dwelt, was near the land which is called Desolation by the Nephites. And if you'll remember, Desolation was the land just north of that narrow neck of land where Mormon's armies gathered to keep the Lamanites from invading at the time of the last battle. Just south of that neck of land was Bountiful, where the Savior appeared to the people. Desolation is also where King Limhi's people would eventually find Ether's 24 gold plates and the ruins of the Jaredite civilization, which tells us that the Jaredites, as a civilization, did not move very far geographically from where they first landed. A few generations after Ariha, during the reign of King Shul, prophets began telling the people to cease their wickedness and idolatry, lest they bring a curse upon the land and be destroyed. And these prophets were mocked and reviled by the people. But King Shul, it says, did execute judgment against all those who did revile against the prophets. He further passed a law that allowed prophets to travel unrestricted throughout the land. And by this cause the people were brought unto repentance. Wars ended, Shul executed righteous judgment, and he begat sons and daughters into his old age. And perhaps now you have a better understanding of why the detail, begetting sons and daughters into his old age, was relevant. But the Jaredite civilization was now underway, and that's all we have time for. First, we need to answer our trivia question. In the Book of Mormon, which person is recorded as having the most children? And the answer to that one is Ariha, who we just discussed a minute ago. He begat 31 children. It makes me curious whether people who were in the royal family ever outnumbered the people outside of it. 31 is a lot. Anyway, we will see you next time.